Can you hear me? You are in mute.
I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, now I can hear you.
Here, my friends. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Good, good. How about you?
Great.
Mr. Mullin, good to see you again, sir.
Nice to see you too. It's a good word.
Yes, sir.
How's everybody doing? All right? You going okay today?
Everything doing good. Everything's going to be awesome now with you here. So, Michael, you remember Aldo too, right? Aldo was in
Yo.
Brazil with you.
Nice to see you again, Aldo. How are you?
He's at the English channel, sir. So if you click on the English button, you're going to be able to hear us exclusively in your ears.
Now I got you. I can. Please call me Michael. Yeah, call me what the heck you want, but yep, good. Good to see you. So anything in particular I need to know? I mean, I'm just going to kind of throw my slides up and just kind of run from that. My lighting okay? Okay, good.
Sim. Michael, você já deve estar me ouvindo na voz de um dos nossos mágicos aí, né? Ok, maravilha. Michael, você vai compartilhar slides, então se você já quiser testar para ver se vai estar ok, aconselho a gente testar agora.
Remind me what I do for that. Where do I do that?
Você vai ali embaixo no Share Screen.
Yeah. Dozens of times have I done this too, for Pete's sake. Usually my PowerPoint pops up. I don't know why it's not popping up. I'll just go with desktop.
Está abrindo aí.
I get that. How's that?
Funcionando perfeitamente. Maravilha, Michael. Você trabalhou hoje? Estava atendendo hoje, meu amigo?
Okay, I'll try really hard. I'll try really, really hard. I had a couple of clients this morning already, yes. A couple new ones. Every day is a work day.
Concordo. Todo dia é dia de trabalhar. Apesar de que estou tentando não trabalhar todos os dias, pelo menos um dia na semana tirar como folga. Vamos ver se consigo, né?
I understand. I'm actually going to Greece on September 3rd for 3 weeks.
Uau, para trabalho?
It is not work.
Oh.
A lot of days I won't be working finally.
Mas você está indo, não entendi. Você está indo então viajar para a Grécia a passeio com a família, é isso?
Just for fun. I did hear from a colleague, so I'm going to be going to Cyprus for a couple of days, and I'm going to teach a one-day course when I'm there. But other than that, it's all fun and vacation. Go with 10 friends, so it'll be a good time.
Isso é muito bom. Vai ter uma férias com a
Brazil would be better.
Então vamos tentar um dia organizar férias no Brasil.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Começaremos em 2 minutos, Michael. Só mais 2 minutos.
Great. Good. And yourself, how's things down in Atlanta way there?
Vou te falar que aqui estamos tendo alguns casos de COVID, né, de Covid, mas estamos tentando manter novamente as máscaras em lugares públicos. Até hoje eu e Érica ainda não estamos encontrando muitas pessoas, estamos mantendo o distanciamento, mas ainda precisamos manter a cautela, né? Como está aí?
Maine, yes. First, give Erica my best, please. Lovely woman that she is. We're pretty good. I'm actually going to an outdoor concert this evening that's requiring vaccination cards. So that's a good step in the right direction, in my opinion.
Mas eu vi que, não sei o seu estado de Maine, mas eu vi que Massachusetts era o estado que tinha mais número de pessoas com as 2 doses da vacina.
Yeah, I think Vermont's number 1, but the Northeast is all really pretty high. Maine's very high. I mean, I feel like I'm in one of the safest places in the world, frankly, in many ways. But it's the Northeast, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, not New Hampshire, Maine. We're kind of, it seems to be working pretty well. It seems to be working pretty well.
E uma coisa que eu tenho aprendido em quase 11 anos de América, talvez 10 anos e meio, tenho aprendido a entender um pouquinho mais sobre os Estados Unidos, né? E é claro que o maior nível educacional dos Estados Unidos está no Northeast, né? Assim como talvez o maior poder econômico está no Northeast, e agora as pessoas com maior número de vacinação estão no Northeast. Assim como as pessoas mais inteligentes desse congresso.
Yeah, but I moved here.
Ok. Então minha brincadeira falhou.
Yeah, no, all good. So quick question. So I have 60 minutes and then 30 minutes for Q&A. So if I go over a little bit with the talk part, that's okay then.
É totalmente normal, porque aí a gente pode reduzir um pouquinho das perguntas e respostas. Sempre depois dos 90 minutos, nós teremos 15 minutos de pausa para o próximo palestrante, que é a Su Falsone. Então, teremos tempo aí, caso você precise esticar um pouco, a gente reduz na pergunta e resposta. Acredito que o mais importante é você conseguir passar as informações durante a palestra.
Good.
Tá faltando luz. Agora você pode me ver melhor?
I can see you better.
Porque eu não tinha ligado a luz. Então vamos iniciar, Michael. Está pronto?
Ready.
Maravilha. Pessoal, boa tarde. Sejam bem-vindos, sejam bem-vindas. Vamos iniciar o nosso bloco da tarde com nada mais, nada menos que Michael Mullin. Michael Mullin é um treinador esportivo e clínico com mais de 30 anos de experiência. Michael, se eu falar alguma coisa errada aqui, você me corrige, hein? Experiência em treinamento e reabilitação. Ele é o proprietário clínico da Integrative Rehab Training e atende clientes em estúdio em sua casa em Cumberland Center, Maine. Ele é instrutor atlético certificado NATA e assistente de fisioterapia registrado na Califórnia. O Michael foi uma das pessoas que mais conseguiu trazer para o mundo do treinamento físico a importância de trabalhar a respiração para conseguir atingir outros benefícios, né? Ele está vindo com a palestra dele, Gerenciando e Otimizando Pressão e Tensão. Michael, é um prazer ter você conosco. Para mim, você não é apenas uma referência, mas você é um amigo pessoal, porque você foi o primeiro, não digo primeiro, mas um dos primeiros que me deu muita atenção, paciente com meu inglês horrível, que hoje também não está muito melhor do que há 10 anos atrás, 5 anos atrás. Muito obrigado por ter você aqui novamente. É um prazer, Michael. O microfone é seu.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the wonderful translators Thank you to Carlos, you're such a dear friend, and thank you for going out of your way yet again, and Erica, obviously, for both of your work trying to put this together. It would be wonderful if we were in Brazil, but certainly it's understandable under the current situation that we need to make some accommodations. An honor to be here. I own a practice called Integrative Rehab Training, which I've been in existence for about 6 years now. I do a combination of rehabilitation and training. It's what I call a hybrid approach, because I see a lot of people who have a lot of problems, a lot of pain, have been to a lot of different professionals for help and haven't had success. And on the other end of the spectrum, I see people who are dealing with just a chronic back issue and want to train and be fit and be more active and want to manage that, and then everywhere in between. This week was a great example of, I saw everyone from 8-year-olds to someone in their 80s. So I have a very diverse clientele, which just makes my job fabulous. I feel very fortunate to be able to come today to share some things that I've learned over the years, some things that I find helpful and successful. I find that there's been a lot of things that I continue to grow and develop as part of my model and my practice. I've made some mistakes, so I hopefully can be able to kind of teach you to be able to do things so you have a much more direct path towards you being successful over the course of the coming years. I've been in practice for about 30 years, and I feel fortunate to go every single day to my job and never feel like I'm working. So why am I here talking about managing and optimizing pressure and tension? Sounds like a complicated topic, and we'll get into some different definitions of some things that kind of seem initially like they're not related to human structure and function. But hopefully I'll be able to tie everything together fairly well so that you have a good understanding as to why I'm describing things the way that I am, because I hope it helps to create a different picture about the way that you think about the human body so that you can be more comprehensive with the clients and the patients that you see. Because I do part rehabilitation and part training, you'll hear me say clients and you'll hear me say patients. Some of the physiotherapists refer to your people that you see as patients. Some in the fitness industry refer to your people as clients. So you may hear me use those words fairly interchangeably. Okay, so let me just get myself going here. All right, so you can see by this little kind of tree of information that we're going to be going through some stuff. And I try to put it in an order that will allow it to be able to flow in a way of education, but also in a way to kind of build up a base of understanding of certain definitions of some concepts, and then put them into perspective related to anatomy, put them into perspective in relationship to the physiology of things and how things work internally more than anything else. And then we'll talk about it from an external perspective as ways that you can assess, look at, and potentially create some interventions that will allow you to be more successful managing some of these things. Again, as I mentioned, I feel that the deeper understanding that each of us have with some of the things that I'll talk to you about will allow you to have a better understanding when you see things with the people that you're actually managing and intervening with. So why pressure? Pressure is often thought of as a negative word, has negative connotations to it. A lot of times we'll think about kind of being under pressure, or pressure just suggests something that's very tight. But there's elements of it that is critical in our understanding of its ability to manage the way that we position our body and manage the pressures inside our body is very, very important for us to be successful for whatever we want to do, whether it's perform at the highest level or whether it's being able to sleep well at night and recover. So I'll go through some definitions and I'll put them into perspective of, as this first slide will demonstrate, mechanical definitions, and then you'll see some other ones as well for all of the things that I'll talk about. So, we need these equations. Equations kind of allow us to sound smart, and, force in terms of like newtons of output and da-da-da. But I want to put this on here because I think it's good to recognize what pressure actually represents. There is a formula because it does have to do with force. And the pressure is actually equal to the force divided by the area that it's actually being pushed against. This picture actually talks about it from a downward force perspective. Easy to think about with us standing on a force plate, jumping up and down. But it's also important to recognize that that application of force in any direction onto something, by something, in direct contact with it, is what we're actually talking about. So it can be that example of that person jumping up and down, but it can also be sled pushes. It can also be tire throws, med ball throws, where now the force is being distributed at angular elements. And the way that that creates pressure against the surface that we're putting against has a big influence on the way that our body can produce that force output. It's the action of a force against an opposing force. So as I put pressure against a cable machine, for example, and I'm putting pressure outward against that force that's pushing back at me at the same time, the size of the handle would dictate the amount of pressure that I can exert against it, because that area might change. I've used the analogy of paddling. I paddleboard a lot. And so the size of the paddle actually will make a difference at the amount of pressure you can put against the water for your force output, because the smaller that paddle gets, there's a sweet spot that allows it to put pressure against the area of the water to allow you to be able to get optimal propulsion to be able to move your body, move the board forward through the water. It's also a force or thrust exerted over a surface divided by its area, like we talked about before. Again, so in thinking about things from pressure perspective, from a mechanical perspective, recognize that angles and direction of that force has a big influence on the pressure output that we're going to exert during a task. A couple of other definitions from a societal perspective. We think about it from a standpoint of the need to get things done. We feel the societal pressure to be able to kind of manage things. We think about it from a standpoint of the force or influence that can't be avoided. The pressure and the timeline to get a paper done, to get ready for a talk for Perform Better Brasil, to be able to have the opportunities to be able to have things taken care of can create pressure on us. But also from an atmospheric perspective, it's the weight of the air in the Earth's atmosphere. And the pressure that we talk about from negative pressure, for example, that's the way that our air enters our lungs, is via negative pressure, and how different things from a standpoint of positive pressure and negative pressure, as well as barometric pressure, all have an influence on the way that we function. People will talk about stiffness in joints or allergies kicking in based upon changes in barometric pressure and weather influence. So our body is constantly responding to all of these mechanical, societal, and atmospheric pressure influences on our system. And then from a medical perspective, there's all these. And this is not a comprehensive list. Got arterial pressure, blood pressure, cerebral spinal fluid, CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure, which is what this woman's wearing as she's in bed at night for sleep apnea. So all of these different things that we see listed here from a medical perspective are all things that our body's trying to navigate and manage as best as possible all day long, every day, in order to be able to create the balance that we're looking for to allow the system to be able to function in an ideal way. Imbalances in these pressure, and it happens all the time, can yield very suboptimal outcomes, not only from a standpoint of performance and general day-to-day feelings, but also your overall health. And we'll talk about some strategies to think about for managing that. So now let's talk about tension and what does tension have to do with what I'm here to talk about today? Well, it's pretty obvious with this awesome picture of these happy faces of these little kids in a tug of war that it's a condition of being held in a state between two or more forces which are acting in opposition to each other. Very clear example with this game that they're playing. It's the type of force that tries to stretch or pull apart a material. Thinking about the fact that this is a rope that doesn't have give to it. So that dense structure is being pulled in both directions consistently by these children. But if you think about maybe perhaps it being a resistance band and how that might change the outcome of this tug of war, because now it's got stretch to it, that will have an influence on the way that your body can then produce the force against that to create the tension necessary for some type of mechanical outcome or performance outcome. And the way that we navigate the tension of our system, again, often denoted with a negative connotation of sorts, is what we're trying to manage from a performance perspective, but also, as I talk about here, from a societal perspective. hostility between two or more individuals or groups. Pretty clear in today's society that there's a lot of that going on, and how that tension that creates is built over time. And from an atmospheric perspective, the statement of the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It almost brings a physical property to it. Much like those happy faces of those children playing that fun game, atmospheric and societal tension creates a lot of elements of resistance is what it produces. And if our system doesn't have a good management in place of the internal tensions of our body and the pressures that are being exerted both externally and internally, then that's what can lead to injury, ailments, pain and discomfort, or loss of performance. There's a medical element with tension. Medical from a standpoint of the partial pressure of a component of a gas mixture dissolved in a fluid such as oxygen and blood. Kind of techie, we're not going to get too deep into that obviously, but there's a medical tension piece related to it, as well as the mental, emotional, or nervous strain that happens. We're in a rampant society of people being medicated for tension-based issues, mental health issues being rampant across the world because of everything that's going on, because of tension in our bodies, in our brains, in our societies, in our atmospheres. But bringing it down to a more practical level, there's tissue tension and the equilibrium that we're looking for, and being able to create that balance of concentric and eccentric activity of muscles, tendons, connective tissue, fascial structures and bone structures, interaction, and how that tension qualities we're trying to create that balance and equilibrium of all the time, recognizing that it's impossible for it to be in equilibrium all the time, but not allowing it to get too far out of that balanced state at any given time. And then much like this picture discusses, there's the length tension relationship and the forces of the active force versus the passive forces, and how that can influence sarcomere length and resting position of tissue. So again, bringing it back to a standpoint of what that's doing, if we happen to combine these two elements, then we start talking about some other principles, which we'll get into now. And this will help to kind of tie things, I think, a little bit better towards human performance and function. Not to go into chemistry with you, by no means trying to overwhelm you with different formulas, but these are concepts that I want to show to demonstrate how it correlates to the human body. This happens to be Pascal's principle, okay? At equilibrium, the pressure inside a vessel, gas or liquid mechanics is the same. Meaning, inside this balloon, there is a balance of pressure throughout the entire balloon. There's a difference in the wall tension, which I'll talk about in a moment, but the pressure is exerted internally at some degree of balance. Gases always move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration, meaning if I got too much gas pressure in one area, it's going to constantly try to seek out a place to create that equilibrium. The analogy I use with people is if you're at a party at someone's house and a bunch of people are in the kitchen, and there's only a few people in the living room, it's not uncommon for people to kind of start to migrate out towards the living room to be able to create a balance at where everybody's distributed throughout the household. Similar concept. Those gas molecules are looking for a place to be able to go where they're not under quite so much pressure to allow that equilibrium to occur. So a change in pressure in one part is transmitted without loss to every portion of the fluid and to the walls of the container. So now we're talking about the walls of the container itself, and that's the wall tension. And as you can see with the big part of the balloon, that there's much more tension on that balloon surface than there is on that smaller end of the balloon, where there's much less wall tension. You can actually kind of flick it because it's much less stiffness to it because of that change. Recognizing internally the pressure being all the same distributed, but how there's a different stress on that container of that balloon that's created by that change in wall tension because of the way that the distribution is internally. From a practical level, if you think about the way that this wall tension envelops force production. This is a representation of a hydraulic lift. So water is incompressible. So you push water through this thing on that small little plunger on that side. You push against the water, and there's enough force it can produce to lift a vehicle on the other side. And there's wall tension around that whole structure that's needed and necessary to manage those internal pressure forces that's happening against the walls of the container to create the force output necessary to lift that vehicle. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about vehicle lifting, much like I'm talking about deadlifting. And if you think about this person who's deadlifting with his feet on the ground, mirroring the pressure being exerted down through this small tube, that the fluid that's being pushed against the wall of this hydraulic lift is similar to the pressure and fluids being pushed against the walls of this individual to lift that external structure. And if you think about things from this perspective, that it's pressures and fluids and management of that, and not thinking always about, oh, what muscle is he using to lift that barbell? Then I think you'll be much more successful when you think about how to position people for doing any type of exercise activity or for performance. It is not just muscles lifting that weight. It's not just joints managing and not failing to lift that weight. It's a combination of muscles and tendons and bones and joints and connective tissue, storing energy and managing the container necessary with adequate wall tension circumferentially to allow the force output to lift that weight. So this is a good representation of the size of the container and how in Laplace's law, because I think I want a law named after me. Mullin's law is, I got to come up with one. Laplace's law is the larger the vessel radius, the larger the wall tension required to withstand a given internal fluid pressure. The pressure and radius are used to measure the wall tension, and how the different size of the cylindrical vessel that this represents, much like the balloon having different elements of pressure against it, changes with fluid being pushed up against it. And how this representation right here of the different size of the vessel denotes how much wall tension is placed upon the outer surface. And how two vessels having the same wall tension, the smaller the vessel will have more pressure. Will have higher pressure. Again, we'll talk about how this pertains to the human body in a moment, but it's good to recognize how these things change over time. Change based upon the individual structure that there is. My apologies, I just got distracted for a moment. My dog just went chasing after the UPS guy. I heard my wife yelling at him, so I got a little distracted there momentarily. So let's bring it to the human body now. And let's talk about these two structures. And you can see that they're markedly different structures just based upon design. And if we want to talk about containers and wall tension and how this individual right here, if you can see my cursor, on his backside, the amount of compression he has on that area and the amount of tightness there is in that area, not allowing expansion to occur as easy for things to push against, versus the wall tension he has on the front here, which, as you can see, has much more distension to it. It's more lengthened. It doesn't have the integrity of the backside. Too much, too little. Too much, too little. Throughout the body, we can find this with different people. Too much wall tension, too much concentric activity, too much tissue in a shortened state. And I said tissue, I didn't say muscles. Tissue in a shortened state, not allowing things to be a balanced container to allow optimal expansion and compressive capabilities to allow the body to do, for example, what that previous slide showed, which is deadlift a lot of weight. And now this young woman here has a very different container structure. And you can see she's much more narrow. She's much more compressed front to back, both sides. Chest and sternum, back and low back, stomach. If you saw her from the front, ribs very inward, very compressed. And how these represent to me when I see clients, not only just a physical structure, but sometimes a behavioral representation as well. Not always, but often. I saw a new client the other way, came in very similar structure as this young woman, sitting, and I was talking to her with her legs crossed and her arms crossed like this, wadded into a little ball. And she said, and I quote, "I feel like my world is caving in on me." Her whole system is so compressed that she has no expansive capabilities. And now we're bringing it back to the definition we talked about before, where her brain feels a tremendous amount of pressure and tension internally, physiologically, and mentally, because they're going together. It doesn't have balance, and it knows it. That was deep, but that's how I think, because I see some really complicated people. So what is surface tension? And why does surface tension matter? Well, it matters a lot. So as you can see with this picture here, this is obviously, let's say, a liquid in a container, and how the fluid inside the container out near the top, you can see the lines of force are being pushed in all directions from the molecules of the water, and how on the surface, it's actually only being dispersed linearly. It's not being dispersed in all direction. That's what the surface tension represents, is that pulling apart of the surfaces of those molecules, but not so much that it creates true separation. These water skippers right here on the right-hand side are little creatures that have learned, as you can tell by their body position and the way that they splay things out, they've learned to maximize that surface tension, to be able to skip along the surface. They're really lightweight, I get that, but that element of that surface tension creates a buoyancy for them. It's a resistance that acts to preserve the integrity of a surface. It's the surface of a liquid, where the liquid is in contact with a gas and acts as a thin elastic sheet. That matters because we need that inside our body, because our body is filled with fluid. And we need good surface tension capabilities for all of those fluids to do their job most effectively. And how there's an element that we visualize the internal pressure, which tends to be pushing things apart, is counteracted by the surface tension acting around the perimeter, much like wall tension, and how that's managing that internal pressures as best as possible. Similarly, when managing the fluids we have internally, we're trying to manage as much as possible. Again, from a practical perspective, what does that look like? The swimmer is a great representation of that. And you can see how the water has glazes over his body, and how in this position right here, as he pushed off the wall and is using that surface tension, that linear tension of that fluid, he's just below the surface to maximize his ability to be able to move through the water most effectively. And as soon as his water breaks that surface tension and start moving, that now things are a little bit more scattered, a little more chaotic. And in a much more graphic representation, that I just love this picture, is this right here. The shark literally bending the water as he comes up out of the water. There's elements of electromagnetic stuff taking place and things like that, but how that shark coming up is able to take that surface of that water and bring it up and bring it up and bring it up until eventually pushing through that surface. I wouldn't want to be on the other end of that surface tension, but that being said, how fluid can be used in such a way that we can use it as a force for good for us internally when we learn how to manipulate it and put it into positions to maximize the things that we're looking to do. Plus, it's a really cool picture. So now we got interface or interfacial tension, which is the surface of a liquid where the liquid is in contact with another liquid. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because we've got layers of fluids and we got layers of tissue. So as you can see from this picture, we've got this pleural cavity, we've got this visceral pleura, and we've got this parietal pleura. We need these layers of fluids to be able to hold things in place. Again, think suction. And the ability of these structures to maintain this fluid contact that creates the suction necessary for us to be able to move most effectively. It helps contain things, kind of like being able to morph and move in all directions because we've contained all of these structures. And that if at any point you break the surface tension of those fluids, and as I mentioned before, much like the swimmer, things become a little more chaotic. You have some energy leaks. There's not as much containment of structures to do what we want them to do, to allow us to move most effectively, or for our bones and joints to be able to stay in a good place. It can happen if we're not in a balanced, pressurized, tensile state as often as possible during our daytime. It leads to close apposition of organ and tissue surfaces, which also allows for transmission of movement. Apposition means to come in contact with. So we want this close contact of these organs to be able to manipulate around each other. The analogy I tell people is I want to have you be able to move your outsides independent of your insides. I don't want things moving like a big blocked unit unless I want it to for something that requires a lot of force output, such as a deadlift. Then I want to contain them all together in a much more stabilized way. But from a performance perspective for movement, I want to kind of have these things be able to move more independent of each other so that we can develop flow movements, what I call flow state, to allow the body to get to a position where it can function optimally. It creates a vacuum effect via negative pressure, which allows the lungs and other organs to be suctioned against opposing structures as well as expand and compress. During inhalation and exhalation, there's this constant balance of pressures and tensions along our insides. And many times we're not thinking about it more than just we breathe to survive. We breathe to survive for the gas exchange necessary, but we breathe to survive because of the pumping that's necessary to move our organs, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So what does that all mean? The goal is to manage and balance out internal pressures, front to back, think of that picture of those two people, top to bottom, and side to side, in order to optimize the use of internal tensional properties for movement, force production, and recovery. Again, there's that balance of what we want, whether I want to have high levels of it for performance, or whether I want to have balanced levels of it for rest and recovery. So fluids, why do fluids matter? You know, since we are mostly made of fluid, we are constantly trying to utilize these pressure and tensional properties to manage our insides. I put this picture here because it represents the percentage of fluids in each of these structures. And I've read somewhere, different places say, oh, we're made of 75% water or 80% water. We're actually made mostly of water. And as we developed as an embryo, we were fluid-based right from the start. On the cellular level, we're talking fluid-based. Cells literally make decisions during growth and development, embryonically, of what structures are going to take on. And hopefully they take on the appropriate structures with the appropriate content that they need for things to work ideally. But if we're not thinking about things from a fluid perspective, like I talked about a little bit before, then that's where we begin to get a little bit hung up on the muscles and the joints, which allows us to lose sight of some very important factors. For example, bones bend. I saw a client 2 days ago. She came in, she literally had I didn't tell her this, but she literally had a bent sacrum. because her body has been pulling in such an imbalanced way that that sacrum went from this shape like this to this shape like this. And what do I mean by bones bend? If our bones didn't bend, we'd be breaking them all the time. We think about things from a dead guy anatomy perspective. We think about things from an anatomical model perspective, where bones are hard. Well, bones are hard, but in a living structure, they're softer than we think. A good analogy is if you take a branch and you snap it off a tree, it bends. If that branch fell off the tree and was on the ground for 3 months and you picked it up, it snaps. Dead guy anatomy, live guy anatomy. So we're constantly manipulating our tissues and utilizing this container maximal control of wall tension to move those fluids and structures as fluidly as possible, because our bones, in many ways, is literally floating inside our connective tissue structures. And we're using gravity to help manage the way that we do these things. Again, I'm a deep thinker, which means cue the breathing. As Carlos mentioned earlier, I've been on the breathing hunt for over 20 years now, reading about it, taking courses, talking to colleagues, educating my clients on it. And if I talk about breathing over the course of this next little bit that I'm going to talk, again, the O2, CO2 stuff matters, obviously, but it's the most powerful tool that I use, along with education for the clients that I work with, to manipulate structure, to allow it to change its position, so I can optimize a shape change that allows a good container to manage those forces that we talked about before, so that they can move more freely and comfortably. And what that does is allows them more options to be able to have access to do things much more comfortably and easily, without the compensations and limitations that they have. So I put this up here because I think this is a nice picture of demonstrating the relationship between the rib cage, sternum, diaphragm, lungs, this whole region of what's going on down through here, this thoracic outlet area, this diaphragm attachment on the spine. Whoops, sorry about that. I'm gonna get this, there we go. How the different parieto-mediastinal pleura, like we talked about, the fluids that surround structures, all of that is an incredibly complex network of things that needs to take place in order for us to be able to maximize our respiratory process, and therefore our pressure management. But now let's talk about it from a standpoint of tubes, canisters, and vessels. So I like this picture because it represents a couple things when it comes to tubes. It's showing a picture of the trachea, which is where the air comes in and goes down into the lungs. And you can see this bronchus on both sides here, on the right versus the left side, are different, which matters. I'll talk about it in a little bit. But that difference in the way that our air enters our lungs, obviously this is representative, is going to be a little bit different on the right versus the left side, which is also evident in the fact that our right lung is different by structure than our left lung, not only in its shape, but also its internal structure, with there being 3 lobes on the right and 2 on the left. And so how does that angle influence things as well too? Well, there's a steeper slope on that right, but it branches out smaller much sooner on this right side than it does on this left side, allowing this left side a little more path of least resistance, if you would. But I also put it here to demonstrate what we don't always think about, which is right underneath up here is where that splits to go into both directions, to enter our lungs, to allow the air to be able to go in. And how this cross section here demonstrates tubes of the esophagus and the trachea. And that esophagus is flat, and the trachea rests right on top of it, like this. And that esophagus runs right along our cervical spine. And how if you've got a cervical spine that's lost its cervical lordosis, is torqued or twisted, and how that can influence the way that actually we're able to swallow or actually take in air because of the twist that would occur, or because of the compression that might occur as a result of that. and that there's this element of picture here of now as that trachea comes down and enters the lungs, and this is representative of what they call the hilum of the lung, or the root of the lung, where the aorta, vena cava kind of go in and kind of exchange the air. Tell people it's kind of like lungs are like crock pots. I don't know if you know what crock pots are, but you put a bunch of stuff in, you turn it on, and you get this really kind of cool mixture of things that taste delicious when you're done. It's the same thing. We pull air in, mixes around, pushes out to the very end, all the way out to this alveoli, where it's absorbed into the blood, which the alveoli rely on surface tension to function. So that surfactant, which allows the absorption to take place in and out of the blood, is able to do it because of that nice fluid base. And how that oxygen enters the alveoli, and the CO2 leaves the veins and pumps back in, and then we get a different mixture pumping back out. We get the nitrogen, O2, CO2 coming in, and we get much more CO2, same amount of nitrogen coming back out. Pretty cool process. I put this cadaver dissection in there because it just pulls away the lung structure and just shows how complex and how small all those bronchioles and alveoli turn out. I would not have been wanted to be the one that dissected that. It looks like a lot of work, but I think it's a good representation for people to think about things differently than we might already. People, I think about lungs as being kind of hollow, and they're just balloons that fill and close. And that's not the case. They're elastic by design, so they can stretch. And if I'm constantly positioning myself into a position where I'm going to keep stretching the same part of my lungs, they're going to get more and more stretched, and other areas are going to get more and more compressed. And so now I'm going to have less wall tension on the stuff that's overstretched and more wall tension on the stuff that's getting more compressed, which will affect my ability to allow for that balanced pressure distribution to take place, which is what allows us to be able to move most effectively. So here's a canister, the human canister, if you would, because we use the word core and we just kind of throw it around a lot with our clients. I think a lot of people use the word core and just think about it from a standpoint of abdominal muscles, maybe the diaphragm and pelvic floor. I mean, I don't love the word core, but I do use it with my clients just because they understand it's so common a word. It gives some context for people. But I mean, the core, if you really would want to put a name to something, is really kind of like from here all the way through here, all the way down through here. I mean, it's really everything, because we really need to manage the core, which means the center, not the perimeter. That's not the core, that's the canister. Because I want to manage intrathoracic, intra-abdominal, intrapelvic pressures and expansive and compressive capabilities to allow the canister, that's what people, it's kind of like an egg, to be able to open as evenly as possible and close as evenly as possible with good control. And if I change my shape and orientation a little bit for performance, that I don't have to create too much compensation to manage those pressure imbalances that happen because of the shape change of the canister that I put myself in for performance. And how this is a picture, I think this is from DNS, which is the Dynamic Neuromuscular Stabilization. The Institute of Prague does some great courses, some well worth looking into. And how this is demonstrating the pressure of intra-abdominal pressure all the way down to the bottom of the pelvis, intrapelvic pressure. And how we talked about, again, wall tension all through here, creating the ability to manage all those forces, to manage that balanced pressure that's evenly distributed throughout the container, but how that's going to change based upon the size of the container. And if this backside of that container, for example, gets pushed in too much, that's going to change where some of those forces are going to have a tendency to push outward, or what I call energy leaks. And we have more tubes, canisters, and vessels. So it's just a good, just to show real quickly, the mediastinum, they're kind of regions of the thorax that there's space. And that space allows things to be able to move and flow, and how the body's constantly trying to fill those spaces. And that if we're not utilizing the expansive capabilities of opening those spaces and keeping them kind of open to do what they should, the body's going to fill it with stuff. It's going to fill it with bones. It's going to fill it with tissue in an effort to try and help to create that compressive to take up that space. And how we want to keep this back of the body open. We want to keep the low back of the body open. Not everybody. Some people have different needs. But picture those two individuals that I had side by side, and how that woman on the right, she needs opening. Her body's kept taking up all of that space, is that diaphragm, and as those tissue structures became more and more compressed by structure. And how this is a cross section, is someone on their back, feet facing you. That's the right lung and that's the left lung. And these spaces that you can see through here, the pleural cavity, cavity means space, all through here. But in particular, I want you to see how these lungs wrap around stuff. They're all the way around. They fill us all the way from here to here, except where that pericardial heart stuff is. And how those lungs we want to have expand outward in all direction. How that influence can have on the spine itself. That's a vertebrae right there. And how if I'm not getting good expansion in all directions, how that's going to influence the way that the body's going to move. The body's going to move to the point of least resistance. If I don't have something filling it up, taking its space, I'm going to move in that direction. Again, just kind of real quickly, this is kind of a simplistic view. It's not an accurate depiction of the diaphragm, because the diaphragm is different on each side, but just for teaching purposes, as air comes in, that increase in volume, amount of air, means lower pressure, means more pressure against the wall of the lungs. That wall tension will change. And how that decrease in volume means higher pressure. How the ribs and diaphragm do this, and the volume of the chest decreases during exhalation. So we've got this tension on the walls, compression back against the walls. We're trying to create that change in size of the cylinder during exhalation, like I talked about. There will be more pressure on the walls because of that exhalation mechanism. But how that what we call compliance of the chest wall, meaning its ability to be able to open effectively, is going to have a big influence on that. And so people who have difficulty with breathing, or have difficulty with allergies or asthma, things like that, can reflect the way that our body manages those pressures and those expansive and compressive capabilities. I'm looking for a constant balance of these pressures, concentrically and eccentrically. I want a little bit of lengthening at times and a little bit of shortening at times. A little bit of eccentric activity, a little bit of concentric activity. That's in a balanced, tensional state. And how the force of pressure against the wall is also affected by the flow of friction and flow and friction, both with air going in or out. And how as I push on that plunger against that fluid inside that syringe, the pressure is exerted against the walls, again, push out that small surface, and how that fluid's going to go shooting out pretty hard, compared to a more open syringe where that flow comes out a little bit easier, like a garden hose. Turn the water on, water flows out. If I put my thumb over it, create more pressure against wall tension, against the walls of the hose, allows that water to shoot towards the back of the garden. How does it stand from? How does this matter from a performance perspective? How we breathe. So if I'm down here. If I'm up here, I'm going to have more pressure internally against the walls of my lungs, against my abdomen, against my container. My wall tension is going to be much more managed and greater capacity for force production when I can keep that syringe better contained. That's why breathing through the nose itself is optimal. I'll just show this real quickly. This just demonstrates a nice representation of what happens internally. So inhalation, exhalation. Inhalation, diaphragm descends, exhalation. And we want to see that those lungs fill the chest opens, the diaphragm goes down and up well, and over the course of time, the body will try to figure out strategies to make that whole process easier. And then that begins to affect the resting position of those internal structures, including the diaphragm and its orientation over our insides. This is a nice job that talks about the differences of the rib movement and how now we've got bucket handle movement of the ribs on the side, and we've got pump handle movement of the sternum and anterior chest wall on the front. Pump handle. Pump fluids. Diaphragm pumping our organs for digestive purposes. Pumping our cerebral spinal fluid for spinal cord and brain health. Pumping all of our stuff internally to allow for ideal pumping action to occur. I like this picture a lot. It's really cool, well drawn, but also just because of the representation of what it shows from a standpoint of that rib movement, as well as that diaphragm movement, and the change in that diaphragm's orientation inside that rib cage during inhalation versus exhalation. But also wanted to show this one because this also represents the angles of muscles that I'm looking at, and how all of these muscles aid not just in respiration, but also in that wall tension, that container control. And you can see by these intercostals how they're like this. You've got your internal intercostals, you got your external intercostals. External, helping to open things up. Internal, helping to close things down. I want a balance of that. There's supposed to be an angular element to that. So that when I'm doing med ball throws, or I'm doing some type of rotational activity, that it's not just my abdominal muscles and core control or core strength that's managing that. But we have all this spiraling taking place. Helices of tissue like this, lined up on top of each other, that allow the bend and the twist to occur throughout the connective tissue, but also, as this picture demonstrates, that allow for that suction, expansion, and compression from muscles such as these. So respiration is much like life, continual management of various pressures and tension coming from both outside and from within, with some greater than others. Not all pressures are bad. The body's trying to find control and balance of them and position itself to best adapt to them. So it's kind of a deep statement, but if you think about it from a standpoint of what we're constantly managing during our daytime, we think about our life, our day-to-day tasks, our jobs, our personal life. But if we're not in a balanced state that allows the body to be able to manage all these other elements, then things begin to kind of get a little funny. The brain knows it. It's saying, I don't feel right down there, and I want to know why that is, or it can't put its finger on why it's not functioning well. And over the course of time, the body will begin to stack on strategies of compensation to try to adapt to that. Just a couple quick slides to demonstrate organ movement, pressure, tension, and torque. And what do I mean by that? Well, these arrows represent organ movement during inhalation. But I think it's important to recognize that it's not like this picture demonstrates where our lungs literally dislocate out of our chest wall. But that's the direction of movement is what they're demonstrating. Now during inhalation, there's spin that has to happen. The lungs go up and out. And where'd my mouse go? There we go. And how our heart, which is on a leftward axis, does this leftward rotation during inhalation. And how our heart itself doesn't really pump purely.
Heart is made of muscle.
It actually
It's about the size of your fist, and it pumps 5 to 6 quarts of blood a minute.
And as you can see,
the 4 pumping sections of the heart are
the spin,
the right atrium,
is what's moving the fluid.
the
Kind of
right
like
ventricle,
The spin is what
the
moves our
left
insides.
atrium, and the left
So I
ventricle.
think it's good representation, which is why I like to have that on there, because I think it does a good job of demonstrating that everything is spin. The air that enters our body spins in. The blood that courses through our arteries and veins is spinning. It's not just flow. There's always kind of a little bit of a twist to it. And these organs that I'm demonstrating are representative of the spin that happens on our inside. Them spinning guts, like that slide says. And how this pancreas, with that leftward orientation during inhalation. These pictures are from an osteopathic book. Our mesentery, which is at an angle. It's attached on our sacrum and the lumbar spine at an angle. And it's 6 inches long, super dense and thick. But at the other end of this mesentery is 6 meters long. It's a firm anchor on a structure that's angled, that's constantly pulling things on an imbalanced axis. And now during inhalation, how the liver, as you can see, comes out, spins like this, back towards the right, while that stomach spins towards the left. Constantly doing this during our daytime. Our internal structures adapting to that, trying to manage that throughout the daytime. It's not a problem. It's only a problem when we can't handle managing the spin and the torque, and how this internal precession of sorts and rotation and pull on our structures can create issues. As obvious as scoliosis is, to, in my mind, the scoliotic tendencies that all of us have internally. This is just demonstration, it's just a quick video. I don't want to take too much time with this, but it's something I have in my house. But I like it because it's demonstrating how we are. So we go from one side to the other, and you'll see it's not the same. One side has more anchor than the other. That's us. It's the way we move. The goal is to try to manage that imbalanced sway throughout our daytime. So the pressure, tension, and torque is a combination that allows for propulsion at its most minimal to maximal abilities. Feeds athletics and what allows the system to create power. We need imbalances to produce propulsion, to have something to push off of. We need this spiral helical mechanism to create potential and kinetic energy to move most effectively. And if you think of Fibonacci's spirals, Fibonacci was a really cool guy. I encourage you to read about him, but Golden Triangle and his Fibonacci spiral concepts and how this is representative during performance here. And that spiral that I'm demonstrating here that I wrote on this track athlete, representative of his external force production spiral capabilities, as his body is navigating the ground and gravity, producing that angular pressure angular force down into that area to produce the pressure necessary to propulse him forward in a spinning wheel. And having him come out of those blocks at just that right angle, down just at that right angle long enough to maximize that force production, utilizing force over area to create the pressure while managing through wall tension and container control, the ability to be able to then create the force necessary to have him be as fast as he possibly can, while recognizing there's also an internal mechanism that's taking place at the same time. And how those pumping of that arms and that pumping of those legs is allowing the pumping of that diaphragm to go up and down like this, and that pelvic floor to be doing this, to control those organs for force production and propulsion. This is a video of a client of mine, and she's figure skating and just demonstrating how spinning towards in the direction of what the body does easily. She's representative of that leftward spin, right side, leftward spin. And not all skaters, I work with a lot of dancers as well, not all skaters and dancers do this in the exact same direction. There are some that do it the other way, but a majority of them have a propensity to turn and land this way, all the way down to her tuck spin.
Michael.
Yes.
If you don't mind, can you explain everything that you explained during the presentation? Because as the sound was so loud, we could not hear your voice. Sorry about that.
You're good. Just kidding.
Muito bom.
She's demonstrating turn, and as she's going around the rink, she's going in the direction that I talked about. The body has a propensity to want to spin and rotate easier anyway. This leftward movement It's the direction she turned, and she jumped, and she landed, and she spun in a small circle. And many dancers and many aerial artists typically spin in a very similar fashion. It's when they spin in the other direction that it actually looks really intriguing to judges, because it's such a unique thing to see someone spinning in the opposite direction and or landing on an opposite foot. But we don't think about that much. For example, this picture of this skier is actually my son from years ago when he was younger, doing a leftward spin. And you can see this axis that he's created the entire time is going right through that axis, right there, right there, right. You can see that axis that he has that allows him to be able to spin, because that's the way things move easier. Right down to these parkour people, and this person running with his pants on fire for some reason, spinning in that direction, doing a super cool trick. And then of course, you know, a hooded guy with a fire extinguisher in the garage, conveniently there to put the fire out. But, but all that spin is what they're using to their advantage for performance. And can they manage it well? Because left unchecked, mismanaged, or poorly adapted to, this spiraling helical component can create energy leaks where these forces have now found an outlet. Ingrained mechanisms or patterns, previous injury, trauma, and or repetitive actions can then further ingrain this. So there's a couple of videos of people that I thought would be representative to show what's going on. So I'm move those people around here. So I was following this person, just took a video of her just to show that arm. And that's allowing that whole body just to kind of spin as she's anchored on one side, kind of like Mitch, my son, was skiing. That was his axis of rotation. That's exactly what she's doing. And how this collegiate soccer player had no idea her left arm spun like that when she ran. I was seeing her because she had a sprain of a ligament of her knee, non-contact. And so I'm thinking about someone who's really skilled and really fast, running at a high speed with that thing constantly pulling on them, potentially influencing the way that a knee lands and pivots, and creating this what I call spiral defect chaos, meaning it's an element of the way that it spins and you can't control it. And so now the chaos of the situation starts to break down structures and tissues, making people vulnerable to injury. Is compensation basically spiral defect chaos? Spiral defect chaos, by the way, is a term that refers to convection as well as knitting, believe it or not. But I liked the sound of it, and I'm utilizing it here because I think it represents something. It's a defect in the natural order of things, providing a blip in the flow, resulting in a change, which in an attempt to return to its natural path merely further ingrains the strategy. Compensation, strategy, potentially negative outcome. So where's the compression? So a lot of people would say this person has great posture because society talks about shoulder blades back and stand upright and jump your head back. This represents to me, and I know this person, someone in despair, someone who doesn't know how to position themselves effectively during their daytime. Pretty clear his compression is right there. He has a tremendous amount of wall tension all back through there. This man cannot expand back. This man has a lot of compression up top here. Too much pulling him back. But again, from a standpoint of what we think about from aesthetics, he looks very proper. To me, he looks like someone that if they wanted to play sports would be very vulnerable to injury or aches or pains, not even injury. And similarly with her, what do we see? A lot of compression, a lot of compression, a lot of compression, just being squeezed down. And we need to work on getting her body to be able to open up more effectively. And internally, what we want to see is we want to see a good position of that diaphragm. We want to see a diaphragm that's stacked on top of our guts and a pelvic floor that's balanced underneath us. And how at times it can tip. And if I'm constantly doing things in a position where I have compression, I've got sway back, I've got all this compression back here, when I breathe, that diaphragm's going to change its position. And now it can no longer stack on top of that pelvic floor to allow the body to do what it's supposed to do most effectively. Lost good wall tension and container control. So visually assessing, adapting torque is what I call this. This is a high-level runner, manages the ground very well, beautiful runner, frankly, runs better than he walks. I know it sounds weird, but there's people that are like that. But you can see he has a very rightward orientation, very down on that right side. That axis that I talked about before is very compressed down through this side. And it's pushing him forward a little bit. So we've got a very forward hip presentation. That's like this, I'm exaggerating. That he does very well with when he's out running, but not so well because he's there to see me because of an injury and a problem that he had. So he adapted well for his sport. This is a hockey player, very good hockey player. Hasn't adapted as well. Can't move his right arm. Can't get off his right side. Leans heavy to that side. He's had a hockey stick in his hand his whole life, doing this and this. Little of this, a lot of that. Not adapted well. This young woman had no idea she walked like this. Whoops, sorry. Not adapted well. Not adapted well. It's almost like hemiplegia. So sometimes when I video people, I did it this morning, my two clients. Sitting positions, standing positions, walking. It's amazing what they'll see, and they have no idea. This woman adapted for athletics because she was an LPGA golfer. So she is in this position over and over and over again, but also as a professional, that she's kind of doing this now. So she is level at top, but you can see the slope of those shoulders is different. The slope of those shoulders is different. And that difference in that position of those two scapula are representative of a body that's going through twist. It's not just this, it's twist. It's always twist. And she's adapting for aesthetics. She's a jazz musician. So she's taking this internal torque that we talked about, this natural spin, and made it look pretty because she's on stage all the time. So she's created this tension to manage this most effectively for the aesthetics element of what she needs to do, as well as her performance capabilities to allow herself to, her voice output to be able to be ideal. This is a great example of, look at that compression she has. She's protected because her back can be sore at times if she goes to touch her toes. She's been doing it this way. She put it to me for years out of protection. Do you have pain now? No. Really? Not at all. No. Well, just let it relax. I thought I was. Literally the conversation. So she's protecting and trying to adapt to those internal forces that are imbalanced because of what she's concerned of or compensating for, and how this person has created too much. The flattened right there means that person can't expand that upper dorsal rostral thorax. That posterior mediastinum that I talked about can't open superiorly. So he keeps pushing it further and further back down lower. Energy leak right there. So running with compression into his pelvis, coming into his midline. This person's very compressed front to back in particular. Great runner, great runner. But here he is. You can see his feet, whoop, 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 kind of coming right into his midline because that's how he is. Elbows never even meet the plane of his body. A lot of tension, a lot of compression right to that midline.
Go ahead. I'm not going to stop.
After a little time working with him, a little better. You can see his arms can relax a little bit more, a little more even swing through his torso and pelvis. Not quite so pull into his midline. Just took changing his body structure a little bit and retraining in order to have that happen. So this person's following form. So that's my body position. So that's how he was squatting. Very extended squat. Very extended squat. And that's how he was lifting. A lot of weight, frankly, in that position because he adapted to it. Oops, sorry. Actually, I forgot I videoed it.
Two more for me? Great.
not sure about you, but I wouldn't put a barbell on that back. But that's what he's been doing for a long time. So we spend a lot of time working on getting that shape change that we talked about before in order to be able to get him to be in a better position more safely. So then what kind of interventions do I want to use? Capturing the front. So I want to kind of take these people that are in this loss of wall tension, loss of pressure and container control across the front, and be able to establish an anterior abdominal wall and get overexpansion in the front to go in the opposite direction. So I'll put people on their hands and knees and work on that back expansion in that position. I'll get people into a high plank position and have them work on breathing in that position to get that expansion. I'll challenge them by taking one hand up to be able to get drive expansion into one direction, lift the other side, drive expansion to the opposite direction so they can learn to alternate with it. Get people with balls and bands and barbells and all types of stuff. And what I'm doing with here is I'm trying to keep that contained in the front, really reach into that position so that this person can be able to get expansion all the way back through here. And you'd be able to use a little bit of wall support at the same time so he can access posterior structures better to allow that to control it. So he's not constantly using his quads and his low back to do everything for him. Again, hold that position, breathe in that position, move those pressures in different directions. Sometimes, like I showed you with these twisted people, I'm going to torque them the other way. So if they're presenting to me like this and their spiraling isn't in control, I want to spiral them in the other direction. So I have them do it lying down. That was the time when I actually had a bad goatee. I don't know what I was thinking. I have them sit, side bend, grab, change that rotation into a different direction, get that expansion to occur differently than their body wants to. I'm changing it. Hard to breathe in that position for a lot of people because they're just not used to being able to do it because they're not used to that position being able to do it. So I'll get them on all fours and I'll kind of have them breathe and I'll change their position. So this person, each exhale is going back a little bit further.
Hands further forward than your shoulders. Drive through your
driving that
arms,
expansion
hips up,
a little further back each time. Going a little bit lower.
Drive straight
Just trying to
through
get
your
that to
arms,
open up a little bit.
back.
He's going to get his chest wall to open up a little because he's very compressed here because now he's in a position here where that and gravity can help expand that much better. I really want to access hamstrings.
The knees are further back than your
Get a ball there. She's pulling.
Nice job.
She's got a weight
down,
between her
pull those arms. Two more.
She's exhaling. Concentric hamstrings. She's inhaling as she lowers. Back and posterior pelvis expansion. She's pulling from above to really create that good capability of that anterior abdominal wall to do what it's supposed to do. Breathing, inhale, exhale, step up onto the step, inhale, step over on the other side. And so he's walking through the process.
Like that, you got it. Yeah. Feel his ribs rotate, oblique snaps working hard. Nice job.
Moving from side
Nice.
to side. It's a hard activity. Deliberately breathing as they do it. Have them hold the position. High plank.
Yeah,
Press up and
good.
through.
Bend one leg.
Inhale, exhale, bend.
Extend that hip, find and feel the hamstring in the glutes.
So we call it triplanar
Just press
extension
up.
activity. Super
Awesome.
hard. Maintain that
Got it.
position. At the same time.
Give me a breath or two.
Now breathe. Now breathe. Now she's got a container she's got to control. She's struggling. It's okay. At the same time, she's got an alternating activity.
Nice job.
It's a high level
Good job.
activity.
Switch sides when you're ready. Nice job.
It's not a day one activity. I want the base of support to be adequate. So I talk to you about a quadrupod foot. Cue them. Feel the medial side of your calcaneus. Feel the ball of your big toe and the pad and the ball of your pinky toe. Get that pad of that big toe down to be able to create that optimal area management of the ground to be able to create the force production we're looking for to manage pressure. Alternating. Pressing down and through, getting ribs to rotate, kind of like that person moving over that box. Getting somebody to find hamstrings, triceps, hamstrings, triceps, back expansion, abdominal rib control, making it dynamic.
Yeah. What? I said, Houston, we have a problem. I know. What the heck? Good. Do 3 more each way.
She's a hoot. I just want to show you about kind of, at times you can be chatting, but kind of bring them back into reality. So, she's pulling down. She's inhaling, coming down. Inhaling, coming down. Coming up, exhaling to keep that control up front while allowing expansion towards the back, all over the body.
Yeah. What?
So here's compensating, and I caught him.
Good job, hands on the bench, heels on the wall, on the toes. You got it.
He's used to retracting the shoulder blade. Whoop.
Oh, you lost your ribs in the front. Bring your ribs up, right there. Now go. Don't lose that.
That's where he belongs. So he went from a position where he had good container position. A scapula could retract on the back, what we call ER on the back, because he had the proper shape. And then he went back to what he's used to, which is a flat back, which sometimes you need. The heavier the weight, you got to start heading that way. But for retraining a process, we got to keep that container as ideally positioned as possible. Caught him. Reaching and grasping with tension. DVRT sandbags. Thank you, Josh Henkin. Tension. He's pulling it apart. He's those two kids, or he's all those kids having that tug of war with that sandbag. As he pulls it apart, it's a pitcher, collegiate pitcher. Collegiate now, high school time.
And then down.
And working on control.
You feel that transition. Load that left side, and you'll go ahead and bring it over.
Got to control that transition.
That right. Nice job. Straighten that right leg more. Straighten it. You got it. There you go. And down.
Kind of like the pull of that baseball is going to be as he gets from his in his pitching position. Capturing with pressure. Hold tight. Create that tension. Then move. Inhale. Inhale. She inhales and lifts the knee. She's driving that expansion posteriorly in a good way. Make it a little bit loaded more. Control that position. Set, control that position. He tips a little bit too much. It's a heavy bag, but gives you the idea. So what are other benefits? Helps manage your autonomics. Good balance of your sympathetic and your parasympathetic to allow your nervous system and your brain to be happy. Stress management, 100%. It's all about getting your body to feel calm. The person I worked with this morning when we were done our sessions, doing breath work, doing position work, said, I feel much more present. It's like, that's brilliant. Recovery, sleep. Sleep's a big deal. I don't even have time to go into it today. I'm doing a whole 2-day course at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning in October. How about that for a plug? with Nick Lamb on sleep and recovery and breath work. General sense of well-being, much more present is what I heard this morning. Increased tolerance with daily activities, absolutely. You get better flow, you get a better brain and nervous system, you get better movement capabilities, the body and brain are happy. Immune response? Probably. Can't help but think that when things are working better, that your nervous system's better, your body's ability to fight off infection and disease is much better. Allow for integration of all the systems, 100%. In summation, can you feel the pressure? Appreciate the elements that feed into imbalanced pressures among all the systems. Introducing concepts that manage these pressures to decrease compensation, energy leaks, and chaos. Can you handle the tension? Respect internal tensional properties and try to invoke change to best manage them. Optimize surface tension qualities through interventions, allows for ideal movement expression. And I believe that is it. Little time for questions, which is awesome. Ran over a little, but I did want to kind of get to all those concepts.
Olha, eu fiquei aqui rabiscando muita coisa. Olha quanta coisa eu rabisquei de perguntas que eu tenho para fazer aqui. Se me deixarem, eu vou perguntar o dia inteiro aqui para você. Michael, incrível. A gente tem um grupo aqui de profissionais. Já teve gente falando: Michael Mullin tem que estar ano que vem no presencial. Não pode faltar. Já falaram isso aqui, hein? Michael, adorei a apresentação. Muito bom, parabéns. Ficou incrível.
Thank you very much. Everybody,
Gostei da
appreciate
parte
you sitting in. Thanks a lot.
Gostei da parte que você mostrou o rapaz levantando, né, fazendo um deadlift com trap bar, onde você citou que não é apenas músculos executando um movimento, né, tem que pensar em todos os outros componentes. Gostei da representação do comportamento através da análise de postura, que você já viu o comportamento da pessoa pela postura dela. O McGill fala muito sobre isso também. A analogia que você fez da produção de força usando a mangueira de irrigação de jardim, né? Achei impressionante, nunca tinha pensado nisso. E aí a minha primeira pergunta que eu vou fazer aqui para você é o seguinte: a explicação dos movimentos rotacionais, potencializando com respiração, movimentos espirais. Eu já ouvi você falando sobre isso em outras palestras, né? Mas eu nunca te fiz essa pergunta. O quanto, em sua opinião, é importante estimular movimentos rotacionais, explorando a linha espiral do trilhos anatômicos com clientes acima de 65 anos?
I believe strongly it should be for regardless of the age, because many people lose the capacity earlier on and it gets a little worse with age. And so they become more and more linear in their movements, which is why they lose balance, because they don't have this capability to go like this and this. They don't feel safe in their brain or their body to do it. And if they go to a doctor and their assessed balance of how still can they be, and so they're like, oh, my balance is terrible, I'm not still. And so then their message is one of fear. Like, what are you trying to, and I tell people, I want you to feel unstable a little bit. I want you to feel like you wobble a little bit and you keep kind of coming back to midline. So people over the age, let's say of 65, to your point, yeah, they should be doing chops, 100%. They should be doing stuff that works on push-pull. They should be doing things that think about that rotational element to be able to do it in offset foot position, kind of front to back. Maybe not even split squat where they're on their toes in the back, but even both flat feet and then doing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that they learn how to be able to create those rotational forces to feel more safe and comfortable with them. The brain will figure it out. It just needs the opportunity to have the exposure to it in a safer environment, to have it carry over to more day-to-day life.
Excelente. E, Michael, aquela atleta que você mostrou de soccer, que corria fazendo uma leve rotação de ombro, você conseguiu ajudar ela? Ela já está com uma postura melhor na corrida?
Oh, much. Yeah. I'm not doing this. I'm just the messenger. Give them the tools, show them in the right direction, show them things. I use this thing all day long, showing people sitting positions, standing positions, walking, running, squatting. I took a video this morning of this girl squatting. I'll put it on my Instagram. I literally asked her, I'm like, hey, can I use this on Instagram? Because it's a good representation of what before and after in one session can do. Because I do feel very strongly that the way that people like her, that young athlete, do things, some of them do it and they're really good at their sports because they do stuff. So there's always this fine line, in particular with high level athletes, of saying, you do something and you might actually be better because of it. And you might not want to take it all away from them. But if someone's seeing me because of a problem, then I might need to start to think about, hey, well, you know what? This might be something that is beneficial to you, but I got to at least take a little bit away because I think it's also contributing to part of your problem. And that's where the art of the industry becomes a little more apparent than actually always looking for objective measures to drive what you're going to do with everybody.
Entendi, perfeito, Michael. Você poderia, por favor, parar o seu compartilhamento de tela, que vai ficar melhor para a gente ver você bem grande na tela, que aí você fica ocupando a tela toda. Aí, agora você está aqui bonitão na tela toda aí, perfeito. Pergunta do Renato Azevedo. Em uma sessão de treino, você sugere que seja feito então exercício respiratório como recuperativo, por exemplo?
I would encourage it. I mean, one of the challenges that happens, and I get this when I lecture or I consult with people, is the fine line of you don't want to take away someone's training session too much by focusing on a whole bunch of breathing things. So there's this, fine line of education so that they understand why you're trying to have them do what you're trying to have them do, and maybe take a little time to educate them. But I give a lot of people stuff to work on their own. The person this morning, I'm like, all right, we're just going to do this twice just so you understand what I'm doing. But then when you do this at home, I want to have you do it 4 times, because I don't want to take all my time just having them do stuff that they can be responsible for at home. So I'll often show, to answer his question, I might demonstrate something. Hey, I want to have you do this for recovery. Go ahead and get into all fours, kind of crawl up into a little ball. Breathe towards your back and your sacrum and your hips and feel that. And I'll video them. And I'm recording my dialogue. So they can hear my cues and hear my instructions and see them doing it. Okay, do this now. Okay, do this now. And then I either text it to them or record it to them on their phone. Here's what I want to have you do at home. Or maybe have them since you mentioned for recovery in particular, maybe have them finish their session close to on time, and then maybe they can hang around in the corner on a mat doing a couple things you've educated with them to do on their own, so you don't feel like you take away from your training session, but you've already gone through the educational process earlier so they can do it on their own.
Bem interessante você passar dever de casa para eles, né? Bem interessante isso.
I thought 1 second, if I may. They almost always feel better afterwards with it, so it's very motivating. They notice a change.
Uhum. Sim, sim. Camila Lima de Oliveira, ela diz: Michael, incrível palestra. Achei interessante falar sobre tensões e pressões da sociedade também. E acredito que também existam as tensões e pressões pessoais. Eu estou com um cliente que tem depressão profunda e para ele estar na academia é muito difícil. Simplesmente ir já é difícil. Quando chega na academia, dava para ver que ele ficava extremamente tensionado. Não conseguia relaxar. Hoje, após 3 meses, ele está mais relaxado, consegue até conversar mais e se soltar durante as sessões. O início foi desafiador. Enfim, não era uma pergunta, apenas um comentário sobre essas tensões e pressões sociais e pessoais. Hoje o movimento dele é muito mais limpo e leve. Aí obrigado Camila, eu adiciono alguma coisa. Michael, quando você pega cliente desse tipo, né, que já chega tenso, qual é a primeira abordagem que você sugere para os profissionais fazerem num cliente nesse tipo?
Yell at them. Number 1, connection. Just create the connection. Just look them in the eyes. Your body language, beyond non-threatening. Discuss things on a level that's not over their head or too intense. Do you know what I mean? So that connection piece is really number 1. They need to feel you don't want to put any more barriers up. You want to kind of have them feel a little bit more relaxed. Number 2, people like that, I start with lower threshold activities, meaning a little less intensity, a little less resistance, but a little more rotation. So I'll do stuff, as I mentioned, kind of push-pull things. I'll do crawling-based stuff. I'll do things that allow their body to alternate versus squat, goblet squat, deadlift, lat pull down, where they're in this tight, position that's, I don't say one plane because there is no planes, but one position. I want them to flow. I want them feeling movement because now their left and right brain are getting stimulated. Now their nervous system is turning. I know it sounds weird, but it is. It's being lubricated because of this movement. So I really go through alternating and side-to-side activities and split activities more than bilateral activities much earlier with them, just to kind of get their systems stimulated and lubricated.
Gostei dessa sua dica de estimular mais o corpo nesse sentido de fazer até uma dissociação, porque vai criar dissociação da cintura pélvica e da cintura torácica, né? Perfeito, perfeito. Vou aplicar isso na próxima semana já com os meus clientes acima de 65 anos. Renata Azevedo, complementando a sua pergunta, Félix, qual a sugestão para o cliente que não compreende o trabalho realizado e essa crença faz com que o cliente permaneça em dor?
So just to clarify, so they don't buy in. Is that what you mean?
Isso.
Okay. Couple things. Number one, I want, and I'm clear with people about this, I want two things with every session with me. Number one, I want it value added. I want to have them feel like every session they've learned something, they've done something that's been beneficial. They feel like it was worthwhile workout. Number two, I want them to feel a change. So I want to have them feel like something's different. So my buy-in comes with giving them activities and exercises and movements that allow them to explore parts of their body that they didn't know could do what it was supposed to do. I taught one of the people this morning how to get in and out of the chair different than he does. He's like, oh, I never do that. And I'm like, I need you doing that all the time. And he was totally blown away that he always sat towards his right side. He allowed this procession to happen all the time. And when I said, go and sit towards your left side, he almost had a hard time sitting down. He's 32. So educating and finding things about them that you're able to use to teach them better is, I find, very beneficial. The last piece is, when I go through the respiratory retraining process with people, which I talked a little bit about 2 years ago, and I have a bunch of stuff on my website about, they feel different because we've shifted their internal structures, and their exploring of their body is much more comprehensive because they feel things open and move differently. And so they're motivated to do it because they feel different, usually in a good way. And one, if we've created the connection, you've added value to your service, they notice a change and a difference, and then they feel more comfortable afterwards, it usually has some pretty good outcomes.
Excelente. Okay. Não, ajudou bastante, excelente, Michael. Precisamos interromper por aqui, apesar de podermos ficar um pouco mais com você até meia-noite, né? Poderíamos dizer assim. Queria que você deixasse uma última palavra para o nosso público, para a nossa audiência, Michael.
I feel very fortunate to have established a relationship with you, my friend.
Oh.
And I feel very fortunate and blessed to be able to come and present to these people who are here today in attendance. I know it's a Saturday. I know you want to be with your friends and family, but to stay and listen to me and these other fabulous presenters you have, and to take your time out to educate and to get better at what you do is what it's all about. So thank you to everybody for taking the time to listen to me today. Thank you to my wonderful interpreters for being able to help me out a little bit. I hope I went slow enough. And feel free, you have my contact information to reach out at any time if you have any questions at any point.
Ó, só para fechar então, disseram aqui, a Juliana disse, ó, não é à toa que ele é um ídolo. Muito obrigado, Michael. Muito bom ter você mais uma vez. É um prazer sempre, ok? Muito obrigado, meu amigo. Nos veremos em breve, pessoalmente.
Forward to it. Cheers, everyone.
Maravilha. Pessoal, vamos fazer uma pausa de 12 minutos. E Sufalsone volta não, né? Sufalsone chega na próxima apresentação em